Bear cub learns baby's potty training. They master life skills together. The morning mist hung low over the pine trees, creating a veil that made everything beyond the cabin's wooden porch seem like a dream. Ethan Marshall stood at the kitchen window, his coffee mug warming his hands as he watched the sun slowly pierce through the fog. It had been 3 months since he and Lily Morgan had moved to this remote cabin in the mountains with their 18-month-old son, Leo. The decision to leave the city hadn't been easy, but something about this place had called to them, something they couldn't quite explain. The cabin sat at the edge of a vast forest, miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by nothing but towering pines and the occasional cry of a distant hawk. It was peaceful here, almost too peaceful sometimes, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Lily was in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the floor with Leo, who was playing with his wooden blocks. The little boy had just started walking properly a few weeks ago, and now he was everywhere, exploring every corner of their new home with the determination of a tiny explorer. His blonde hair caught the morning light streaming through the windows, making it glow like spun gold. "Leo, sweetie, come here," Lily called softly, holding up a small blue potty chair they had bought just yesterday in town. It was time to start potty training, a milestone that felt both exciting and daunting. Leo toddled over, his chubby hands reaching out to touch the new object with curiosity. He patted it, looked at his mother with those big blue eyes, then promptly tried to wear it as a hat. Lily laughed, the sound echoing through the cabin like wind chimes. "No, baby, it's not for your head," she said, gently guiding him to understand its purpose. Ethan joined them, setting his coffee down on the side table. "You know, I read somewhere that kids learn better when they see others doing the same thing," he said, kneeling down beside them. "Maybe we should show him how proud we are when he uses it." Leo seemed to understand something important was happening. He sat down on the little potty chair fully clothed, looking up at his parents with a proud smile. They clapped and cheered, making him giggle with delight. It was these simple moments that made their decision to move here feel right. No traffic noise, no constant buzz of phones and notifications, just the three of them learning and growing together. But as Ethan stood up to get Leo's training pants from the bedroom, something caught his eye through the window. There, at the edge of the tree line, about 30 feet from the cabin, something moved. At first, he thought it might be a shadow, but then he saw it again. A small, dark shape, sitting perfectly still, watching. "Lily," he called quietly, not wanting to alarm her. "Come look at this." She picked up Leo and walked over to the window. There, sitting on its haunches like a patient student, was a bear cub. It couldn't have been more than 6 months old, its fur a rich brown that seemed to shimmer in the filtered sunlight. But what struck them both wasn't just the presence of the cub. Bears were common in these parts. It was the way it was watching them. Its eyes weren't wild or fearful. They were focused, intelligent, almost contemplative. The cub's head was tilted slightly to one side, as if it was trying to understand something. "Where's its mother?" Lily whispered, instinctively holding Leo closer. They scanned the tree line, expecting to see a protective mother bear nearby, but there was nothing. Just the lone cub, sitting there, watching. For the next hour, they continued with their morning routine, but both Ethan and Lily found themselves constantly glancing at the window. The cub hadn't moved. It sat there with an almost unnatural patience, its dark eyes following their movements through the glass. When Leo had his snack, the cub watched. When Lily read him a story, the cub watched. And when they brought out the potty chair again for another practice session, the cub seemed to lean forward slightly, as if trying to get a better view. "This is strange," Ethan muttered, pulling out his phone to record a video. "I've never seen a bear cub act like this." But as soon as he raised the phone, the cub stood up and melted back into the forest, disappearing as quietly as it had appeared. The next morning, Ethan woke before dawn, unable to shake the feeling that something was different. He made his coffee and walked to the window, and there it was again. The same cub, in the exact same spot, sitting in the exact same position. This time, he didn't call Lily immediately. Instead, he watched the cub watching him. There was something almost human in its expression, a kind of yearning or curiosity that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. When Lily and Leo woke up and joined him in the living room, the cub's attention shifted to them. Leo squealed with delight when he saw the doggy outside, pointing with his chubby finger. "Bear," Lily corrected gently. "That's a bear, sweetheart." They decided to continue with Leo's potty training, trying to ignore their unusual audience. Lily had read all the books, watched all the videos. Consistency was key, they said. Positive reinforcement. Patience. She set a timer on her phone for every 30 minutes, and when it went off, she would take Leo to his potty chair. "Do you need to go potty?" she would ask in a sing-song voice. Sometimes Leo would shake his head and run away. Sometimes he would sit on the potty fully clothed and clap for himself. And sometimes, just sometimes, he would actually use it properly, and the celebration that followed would make him beam with pride. Through it all, the cub watched. Ethan noticed that when they clapped for Leo, the cub's ears would perk up. When Leo successfully used the potty and they did their happy dance, the cub would stand up on its hind legs for a moment, as if trying to see better. On the third day, something extraordinary happened. Leo had just had a successful potty session, and Ethan was helping him wash his hands at the kitchen sink. Lily was cleaning the potty chair on the porch, praising Leo loudly enough for him to hear. "Such a big boy. Mommy is so proud of you." The cub was in its usual spot, but this time it wasn't alone. Beside it, half hidden in the ferns, was what looked like a small pile of leaves arranged in a deliberate circle. The cub walked over to this makeshift circle, positioned itself carefully over it, and did its business. Then it looked directly at the cabin, as if waiting for something. Lily stood frozen, the cleaning supplies forgotten in her hands. "Ethan," she whispered, "Ethan, you need to see this." He came out onto the porch, Leo toddling behind him. They all watched as the cub carefully covered its waist with more leaves, then sat back in its original position, looking at them expectantly. Without thinking, Lily started clapping. "Good job," she called out, the same way she praised Leo. The cub's entire body seemed to vibrate with excitement. It did a little hop, then another, its mouth open in what almost looked like a smile. Leo clapped too, shouting, good bear," in his tiny voice. From that moment on, something shifted. The cub was no longer just watching, it was participating. Every morning, the cub would arrive at the same time, always alone, always patient. Ethan had started leaving out a small dish of water at the edge of the porch. Not close enough to encourage the cub to come nearer, but just a small gesture of acknowledgement. The cub would drink from it gratefully, then resume its position. They had started calling it Barnaby, though they weren't even sure if it was male or female. The name just seemed to fit. Leo would wave it bar-bye every morning, and the cub would do a little head bob in return, a greeting that had become part of their routine. But the real magic happened during potty training time. Whenever Leo successfully used his potty, Barnaby would go to his leaf circle and do the same. When Leo had accidents, which happened often, as it does with all toddlers, Barnaby would simply sit and wait. No judgment in those dark eyes, just patience. Lily had started keeping a journal about their unusual situation. She wrote about how Barnaby seemed to understand the concept of scheduled bathroom breaks, how the cub would appear to get restless around the same times Leo usually needed to go. She wrote about the day Leo refused to use the potty and had a full meltdown on the floor, and how Barnaby had lain down in the exact same position, mimicking the toddler's distress until Leo stopped crying and looked at the bear in wonder. "Bear, sad too?" Leo had asked, and somehow that had been enough to calm him down. She wrote about how Ethan had started talking to Barnaby during these sessions, explaining things the way he would to Leo. "See, Barnaby? We go potty in the special place. That keeps everything clean and healthy." The cub would tilt its head, those intelligent eyes never leaving Ethan's face. 2 weeks into this strange routine, Ethan decided to test something. He had noticed that Barnaby's leaf circle was getting quite messy, despite the cub's attempts to keep it covered. So, one morning, before the cub arrived, he went out and dug a proper shallow hole near the tree line, lining it with soft sand from the creek bed. He even built a little privacy screen from fallen branches, making it look natural but deliberate. When Barnaby arrived and saw the new setup, the cub approached it cautiously. It sniffed around the edges, examined the construction from all angles, then looked at Ethan with what could only be described as gratitude. From then on, Barnaby used this new designated area, maintaining it with the same care Leo was learning to show for his potty chair. The weather was getting colder as autumn progressed, and Lily worried about Barnaby. Where was its mother? How was such a young cub surviving alone? They had called the local wildlife service, but the ranger who came out said that as long as the cub looked healthy and wasn't approaching humans aggressively, they should leave it be. "Nature has its own ways," the ranger had said, though even he seemed puzzled by the cub's behavior. Maybe its mother is nearby, teaching it to forage while keeping watch. Bears are smarter than we give them credit for. But Ethan and Lily knew this was different. This wasn't just a smart bear. This was something else entirely. One morning, Leo woke up and immediately went to his potty without being prompted. He pulled down his training pants all by himself, used the potty, and then called out, "Mommy, Daddy, I did it." They rushed in to find him beaming with pride. Through the window, they could see Barnaby doing a little celebration dance of its own, spinning in circles and huffing in what sounded like laughter. That afternoon, something even more remarkable happened. Leo was playing on the porch with his blocks while Lily watched from the doorway. Barnaby was in its usual spot, but closer than ever before, maybe only 20 feet away. Leo started stacking his blocks, building a tall tower. When it fell over, he didn't cry as he usually did. Instead, he started again, more carefully this time. Barnaby watched intently, then began gathering sticks with its mouth. Slowly, carefully, the cub started arranging the sticks in a similar pattern, trying to balance them against each other. The tower of sticks fell immediately, but Barnaby tried again, and again, and again. Each time, the cub would look at Leo, watching how the toddler adjusted his technique, then try to replicate it. By the end of the afternoon, Leo had built a tower 6 blocks high, and Barnaby had managed to prop 3 sticks together in a teepee formation that stayed standing for almost a minute before falling. When it finally collapsed, Leo clapped for the bear. "Good try, Barby, almost." The cub sat back on its haunches, and if bears could look proud, Barnaby certainly did. As the days grew shorter and colder, their unusual friendship deepened. Ethan had started leaving out small portions of food, nothing that would make Barnaby dependent. Just the occasional apple or handful of berries. The cub would take them gratefully but never begged for more. It was learning boundaries, just like Leo. Lily noticed that Barnaby had started mimicking other behaviors too. When Leo brushed his teeth on the porch one morning, he loved brushing outside where he could spit over the railing. Barnaby picked up a thin stick and rubbed it against its teeth. When Ethan did his morning stretches on the deck, Barnaby would attempt to copy them, standing on hind legs and reaching toward the sky, wobbling precariously but determinedly. The real test came on a particularly cold morning, when Leo had been successfully using the potty for a whole week without accidents. Lily had promised him a special reward, a new toy truck from town. As they prepared to leave for their trip, Barnaby seemed agitated. The cub paced back and forth, making small whimpering sounds they had never heard before. "I think he knows we're leaving," Ethan said, feeling a pang of guilt. They had never left during Barnaby's usual visiting hours before. Lily knelt down on the porch, speaking to the cub as she would to Leo. "We'll be back, Barnaby. We're just going to town. We'll be back before dark." The cub stopped pacing and sat down, but those expressive eyes followed them as they loaded into the car. The trip to town took longer than expected. The toy store was crowded. Leo had a meltdown in the grocery store, and they got stuck behind a logging truck on the winding mountain road home. By the time they pulled up to the cabin, the sun was already setting. Ethan expected Barnaby to be gone, but there it was, sitting in exactly the same spot where they had left it. The cub stood up when it saw them, did its little greeting hop, then something extraordinary happened. Barnaby walked over to its designated bathroom area, used it, then walked to a small pile of objects near the tree line. The cub pushed something forward with its nose, a perfectly round pine cone, placed carefully on a flat rock, like a gift. Leo squealed with delight and started to run toward it, but Lily caught him. "We look with our eyes, sweetheart. That's Barnaby's present to show you." Leo stood at the edge of the porch, looking at the pine cone with wonder. "Thank you, Barbie," he called out. The cub did another little hop, then picked up something else from its pile, a bright red leaf, perfectly preserved. This, too, was placed on the rock. Then a small white pebble, then a feather. Each item was presented with such deliberate care that it brought tears to Lily's eyes. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. This was a friend, sharing its treasures. That night, after Leo was asleep, Ethan and Lily sat on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in blankets and sipping hot cocoa. Barnaby had retreated to the forest edge but hadn't left entirely. They could see its eyes reflecting the porch light, watching over them like a guardian. "What do you think this is?" Lily asked quietly. "I mean, really, what are we witnessing here?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "I think," he said slowly, "we're seeing something that reminds us how little we really understand about the world, about consciousness, about connection." They sat in comfortable silence, the forest around them alive with the sounds of night, owls hooting, wind through pine needles, the distant crack of a branch. The next morning brought the first snow of the season, just a light dusting that made everything look like it had been sprinkled with powdered sugar. Leo pressed his nose against the window, watching the flakes fall. "Snow, Barbie," he called out, even though the cub hadn't appeared yet. But when Barnaby did arrive, later than usual, something was different. The cub wasn't alone. Behind it, keeping to the deeper shadows of the forest, was an adult bear. Not huge, but definitely fully grown, watching from a safe distance. Lily grabbed Ethan's arm, her heart racing. "The mother," she whispered. But the adult bear made no move to come closer. It simply sat and watched as Barnaby took its usual position. The morning routine continued, but with an electric tension in the air. Leo needed to use the potty, and as usual, Barnaby went to its designated area at the same time. The adult bear watched all of this with the same intelligent gaze they had come to recognize in Barnaby. When Leo successfully used the potty and received his celebration, the adult bear stood up, huffed once, a sound that seemed almost like approval, and then melted back into the forest. Barnaby remained, but something in its posture had changed. It seemed more confident, more assured. "I think," Ethan said slowly, "we just met Barnaby's teacher." Over the following days, the adult bear appeared more frequently, always at a distance, always watching. They realized it had probably been there all along, hidden in the deeper forest, keeping watch over its cub while allowing this extraordinary experiment in cross-species learning to unfold. The adult bear never came as close as Barnaby, but they noticed it too had started using a designated bathroom area, further back in the trees but visible if you knew where to look. It was teaching by example, just as Ethan and Lily were teaching Leo. One particularly memorable morning, Leo decided he wanted to teach Barnaby something new. He had been learning to wash his hands properly, singing the alphabet song to make sure he washed long enough. He insisted on demonstrating this on the porch, using the outdoor water basin Ethan had set up. Leo sang the song loudly, rubbing his hands together dramatically, making sure Barnaby could see. The cub watched intently, then walked over to a small puddle from the melted snow. It dipped its paws in, rubbed them together in a rough approximation of Leo's movements, and made a series of soft, huffing sounds that almost seemed like it was trying to sing. The adult bear emerged from the forest that day, coming closer than ever before, though still maintaining a respectful distance. It watched its cub attempting to wash its paws, then demonstrated the proper bear way, using snow to clean its paws and face, rubbing against the rough bark of a tree to scratch and clean harder-to-reach places. Barnaby watched its parent, then looked at Leo, clearly torn between two different methods. In the end, the cub tried both, washing in the puddle like Leo, then rubbing against the tree like its parent. It was learning that there wasn't just one right way to do things. As November progressed, the lessons became more complex. Leo was learning to put on his own coat and boots, a process that involved a lot of falling over and giggling. Barnaby watched these struggles with what seemed like sympathy, occasionally attempting to manipulate objects with its paws in ways that bears typically didn't. One day, the cub managed to pick up a stick and use it to pull a distant apple closer, a use of tools that made Ethan grab his phone to record. "No one will believe this," he muttered, watching Barnaby successfully snag the apple, and then look at them as if to say, "Did you see what I did?" The weather turned harsh in early December, with a real snowstorm that lasted 3 days. They couldn't see Barnaby through the swirling white, and Leo stood at the window constantly, calling for his friend. "Bar by cold," he said sadly. "Bar by needs blanket." Lily tried to explain that bears had thick fur to keep them warm, that Barnaby and its parent were probably snug in a den somewhere, but Leo remained worried. He insisted on leaving his favorite stuffed bear on the porch, so Barby knows we remember. When the storm cleared, they were relieved to see fresh tracks in the snow leading to Barnaby's usual spot. The cub appeared later that morning, shaking snow from its fur, looking none the worse for wear. But it wasn't alone. Behind it, struggling through the deep snow, was another cub, smaller, thinner, moving with obvious difficulty. Barnaby kept stopping, looking back, making encouraging sounds. The adult bear was there too, hanging back but watching intently. The new cub was clearly weak, possibly orphaned, and Barnaby was bringing it to the only place it knew where kindness was guaranteed. Ethan and Lily exchanged glances. They couldn't take in a bear cub. That would be dangerous and illegal. But they could call the wildlife rescue. And in the meantime, Ethan grabbed some of the high-calorie bear food the ranger had approved for emergency situations. He placed it halfway between the cabin and the tree line, then retreated. Barnaby led the weak cub to the food, demonstrating how to eat slowly, carefully, just as Barnaby had learned by watching Leo learn to feed himself months ago. The adult bear watched approvingly, and they realized they were witnessing something remarkable. Barnaby was teaching another cub what it had learned. The wildlife rescue arrived the next day and confirmed the new cub was orphaned and malnourished. They would take it to a rehabilitation center, but they were amazed at its relatively good condition. "Something's been taking care of it," the rescue worker said, puzzled. "Teaching it survival behaviors. We usually see orphaned cubs in much worse shape." They didn't mention Barnaby or the adult bear, who had disappeared into the forest when the truck arrived. Some things, they had learned, were better left unexplained. After the rescue truck left, Leo stood on the porch, looking sad. "Barby's friend go away," he said. But that afternoon Barnaby returned, and behind it, like shadows, were two more cubs, different ones, both healthy but young. The adult bear was with them, and they realized what was happening. Barnaby and its parent were running some sort of forest school, teaching other cubs the things Barnaby had learned from watching Leo. They watched in amazement as Barnaby demonstrated the proper use of the bathroom area, how to wash paws in the stream, how to stack rocks in patterns. The other cubs watched with the same intensity Barnaby had shown months ago. As winter deepened, their unusual classroom expanded. Leo was learning numbers and letters, counting his toys and recognizing the letters of his name. Lily would do these lessons on the porch when weather permitted, bundled in warm clothes. Barnaby had developed an uncanny ability to recognize patterns. When Leo arranged his blocks by color, Barnaby would sort sticks by length. When Leo counted to 5 on his fingers, Barnaby would tap its paw on the ground 5 times. The other cubs watched and learned, and soon they too were attempting these behaviors. One day, a researcher from the nearby university arrived, having heard rumors about unusual bear behavior in the area. Ethan and Lily were reluctant to share their story, worried it might disrupt the delicate balance they had achieved. But the researcher, Dr. Sarah Chen, was different. She observed quietly from inside the cabin, taking notes but not interfering. After watching Barnaby and the other cubs for a week, she was in tears. "This challenges everything we thought we knew about animal cognition," she said. "The capacity for observational learning, the teaching behavior, the cross-species communication. It's unprecedented." But Dr. Chen agreed to keep the location secret, to let this remarkable experiment continue naturally. She helped them set up hidden cameras to document the behaviors without disturbing them. The footage they captured was extraordinary. Barnaby teaching younger cubs, the adult bear correcting mistakes, a whole community of bears learning and growing in ways that seemed impossible. But more than that, it was the emotional connection that stood out. The way Barnaby would look for Leo each morning, the genuine joy in their greetings, the sadness when they had to part. Christmas approached, and Lily wanted to do something special. She strung weatherproof lights on a tree at the forest edge, not bright enough to disturb, but enough to create something magical. On Christmas morning, Leo insisted on leaving presents for Barnaby, a pile of apples, some honey-covered pine cones, and one of his own teddy bears. They watched from the window as Barnaby approached the gifts cautiously, sniffed each one, then did something that made them all gasp. The cub had brought gifts too, a collection of the most perfect pine cones, arranged in a circle, with a bright blue jay feather in the center. Leo wanted to run out immediately, but they made him wait, watching as Barnaby carefully investigated each gift. The cub seemed particularly interested in the teddy bear, touching it gently with its paw, sniffing it all over. Then it picked it up carefully in its mouth and carried it to a sunny spot, where it proceeded to groom the toy the way a mother bear would groom a cub. Leo giggled with delight. Barby has baby now. The adult bear watched all of this from the tree line, and they could swear they saw approval in its eyes. As January arrived, Leo's potty training was complete. He was fully independent, proud of his achievement, and eager to show Barnaby every time. The cub, too, had mastered its bathroom habits, maintaining its area with fastidious care. But their learning had expanded far beyond that initial milestone. They were teaching each other about patience, about friendship, about the bridges that could be built between worlds that seemed separate. Dr. Chen's preliminary paper, published without revealing the location, was causing a sensation in the scientific community. But for Ethan and Lily, the science was secondary to the magic they witnessed daily. One morning, they woke to find strange marks in the snow. At first, they looked random, but then Lily gasped. "Ethan, look at it from the window." From above, the marks formed a rough circle with lines radiating out, almost like a child's drawing of the sun. Near it, Barnaby sat watching them, and when it saw them looking, it added another line to the pattern. Leo had been drawing suns all week, simple circles with lines that he proudly called sunshine. Barnaby had been watching and had attempted its own version in the snow. It wasn't perfect, but it was intentional, deliberate, creative. The adult bear appeared more frequently now, sometimes bringing other adult bears to observe from a distance. They seemed to be having some sort of conference, watching Barnaby and the cubs, occasionally making soft sounds to each other. Dr. Chen was beside herself with excitement. "They're sharing information," she said, "teaching each other about what they've learned here. This could change the entire population's behavior." But she was careful not to interfere, understanding that the magic of this situation lay in its organic development. One particularly cold morning, Leo woke up with a fever. He was cranky and uncomfortable, crying for reasons he couldn't articulate. Lily kept him inside, away from the windows, but Barnaby noticed the absence immediately. The cub paced anxiously, making soft whimpering sounds. When Ethan came out to explain that Leo was sick, Barnaby did something extraordinary. It disappeared into the forest and returned with a mouthful of specific leaves, ones Ethan recognized as having mild medicinal properties that bears often ate when feeling unwell. The cub placed them carefully on the porch, then sat back, looking at the cabin with obvious concern. They didn't give Leo the leaves, of course, but the gesture touched them deeply. This was empathy, clear and undeniable. Barnaby understood that Leo was unwell and had tried to help in the only way it knew how. When Leo felt better 2 days later and appeared at the window, Barnaby's joy was explosive, jumping, spinning, making happy huffing sounds that brought tears to Lily's eyes. Leo pressed his hand against the window, and Barnaby pressed its paw against the glass from outside. And for a moment, the barrier between them seemed to disappear entirely. As February arrived, they noticed changes in Barnaby. The cub was growing, becoming more independent, spending more time with the other bears and less time watching the cabin. It was natural, healthy, but it made Leo sad. "Barby doesn't love me anymore?" he asked one day when the cub didn't appear at its usual time. Lily held him close, explaining that Barnaby was growing up, just like Leo was. "But growing up doesn't mean we stop loving our friends," she said. "It just means the way we show love changes." As if to prove her point, Barnaby appeared the next morning with the entire group of cubs it had been teaching. They arranged themselves in a line, and at some invisible signal they all stood up on their hind legs and did a little dance, the same celebration dance Barnaby did when Leo successfully used the potty. Leo laughed and clapped, and the cubs all dropped back down looking pleased with themselves. It was a performance, a gift, a way of saying that the connection remained even as things changed. The weather grew warmer, and with it came new challenges and opportunities. Leo was learning to ride a tiny bicycle with training wheels, falling repeatedly but getting back up each time. Barnaby watched these attempts with interest, and while it couldn't ride a bike, it began practicing balance in its own way, walking along fallen logs, standing on hind legs for longer periods, even attempting to walk bipedally for short distances. The other cubs followed suit, and soon the forest edge looked like a circus training ground, with young bears practicing feats of balance and coordination. One day, a family of hikers got lost and wandered near the cabin. They were frightened to see so many bears, but Ethan quickly assured them the bears were harmless. Still, he didn't mention the true nature of what was happening. The hikers left with a story about a strange cabin where bears seemed unnaturally calm, but they had no idea about the profound experiment in interspecies learning they had witnessed. After they left, Barnaby approached the spot where the hikers had stood, sniffing curiously. The cub looked at Ethan with what seemed like a question in its eyes. "Those were other people," Ethan explained, feeling slightly foolish talking to a bear. "Like us, but not family." Barnaby seemed to consider this, then returned to its usual spot, apparently satisfied with the explanation. March brought the first hints of spring, and with it, a bittersweet realization. The adult bear was preparing to leave, to take Barnaby and the other cubs deeper into the forest for the seasonal foraging that would teach them to survive on their own. They could see it in the way the adult was gathering the cubs more frequently, leading them on longer expeditions away from the cabin. Barnaby seemed torn, looking back at the cabin often during these departures. Leo sensed it too, becoming clingy and emotional. "Barby, stay here," he insisted repeatedly. "Barby is family." Dr. Chen arrived for what she said would be her last observation session. She had enough data to write a groundbreaking paper, but more importantly, she understood that this chapter was ending. "What you've witnessed here," she told Ethan and Lily, "is going to change how we think about animal intelligence forever. But more than that, you've shown that connection doesn't require words. It just requires openness and patience." She took one last photo of Leo waving at Barnaby, the bear cub waving back in its way, two young beings who had learned together, grown together, and would never forget each other. The last week of March was unseasonably warm, and they spent as much time as possible outside. Leo showed Barnaby every new thing he had learned: how to pump his legs on the swing, how to catch a ball, how to write his name in the dirt with a stick. Barnaby shared its own new skills, finding edible plants, catching fish from the stream, building a proper daybed from branches and leaves. They were exchanging final lessons, though neither fully understood that's what was happening. The adult bear watched all of this with what seemed like patience and understanding, allowing this goodbye to unfold naturally. On the last morning of March, Barnaby arrived earlier than usual, while the sun was just beginning to light the sky. The cub brought one final gift, a smooth river stone with natural markings that looked almost like a heart. It placed this carefully on the porch, then sat in its usual spot one last time. When Leo woke up and came outside, still in his pajamas, Barnaby stood up and walked slowly toward him. They stopped about 10 feet apart, close enough to really see each other, far enough to remain safe. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, and in that look was everything: gratitude, love, understanding, and goodbye. Barnaby made a soft sound, almost like a sigh, then turned and walked toward the forest where the adult bear was waiting. At the tree line, the cub stopped and looked back one more time. Leo waved, tears streaming down his face. "Bye-bye, Bar-bye. Love you." The cub raised one paw, held it there for a moment, then disappeared into the forest with its parent. They could hear them moving through the underbrush for a few minutes, the sound growing fainter and fainter, until there was only the normal forest silence. Leo stood on the porch for a long time, holding the heart-shaped stone, looking at the empty spot where his friend used to sit. 2 chapters of Part 1 completed. The days after Barnaby's departure were hard for Leo. He would stand at the window every morning, watching for his friend, calling out, "Bar-bye, Bar-bye, come back?" It broke Ethan and Lily's hearts to see him waiting. But they knew this was part of growing up, learning that some friendships exist in seasons, perfect and complete in their time. They kept all of Barnaby's gifts in a special box, and Leo would often take them out, telling anyone who would listen about his bear friend who learned to use the potty. Most people smiled indulgently, thinking it was a child's imagination, not knowing the profound truth behind the story. April passed slowly, with Leo gradually accepting that Barnaby wasn't coming back. But he never forgot. He would still wave at the tree line every morning, just in case. He kept practicing all the things he had learned, as if maintaining them kept the connection alive. His potty training was flawless. He never had accidents, always washed his hands, always maintained the same careful routine they had established together. It was his way of honoring what they had shared. Lily continued documenting everything in her journal, knowing that someday Leo would want to know that it had all been real. One morning in early May, something extraordinary happened. Leo was playing in the yard when he suddenly stopped and pointed at the forest. "Mommy, Daddy, look!" There, at the tree line, was a bear. Not Barnaby, this bear was bigger, its fur a slightly different shade. But it was young, maybe a year or 2 old, and it was watching them with that same intelligent gaze. More importantly, it was sitting in exactly the same spot where Barnaby used to sit. The bear had something in its mouth, a piece of bark with strange markings on it. It placed this carefully where it could be seen, then sat back and waited. Ethan approached cautiously and retrieved the bark. The markings were deliberate, scratches that formed a rough pattern. It took him a moment to realize what he was looking at. The scratches formed a crude but recognizable shape, the sun drawing that Barnaby had made in the snow months ago. This new bear had been taught the symbol, had been told about this place, about them. "It's a student," Lily whispered in amazement. "Barnaby is teaching others what it learned here." The new bear watched them examine the bark, then stood up, did a little hop, Barnaby's signature greeting, and walked to the designated bathroom area that hadn't been used in over a month. They realized then that Barnaby's legacy would continue. This new bear, and perhaps others, would come to learn, to observe, to bridge the gap between wild and civilized in their own unique way. Leo was thrilled. "Barby's friend," he declared, immediately accepting this new visitor. They started calling the new bear student, though they would later learn from tracks and observation that multiple young bears were visiting, each learning the protocols that Barnaby had established. The bathroom area was maintained and used properly. Gifts were exchanged: pine cones for apple slices, interesting rocks for small toys that Leo had outgrown. Dr. Chen returned when she heard about the new developments, this time with a small team of carefully selected researchers. They set up more sophisticated observation equipment, all hidden and non-invasive. What they documented over the following months would revolutionize the understanding of animal culture and learning. The bears were teaching each other not just practical skills, but abstract concepts, symbols, schedules, even basic counting. One bear learned to arrange stones in groups that corresponded to the number of times Leo rang a bell. Another figured out how to use a stick to draw patterns in the dirt, copying Leo's attempts at letters. But the most remarkable moment came in late June. Leo was having his 3rd birthday party on the porch. Just the 3 of them, a small cake and some balloons. They were singing "Happy Birthday" when movement at the forest edge caught their attention. There, barely visible in the dappled sunlight, was Barnaby. The cub had grown considerably, its face more mature, its body filling out with muscle. But those eyes were unmistakable. Beside Barnaby were 3 smaller cubs, clearly younger, watching with nervous curiosity. Barnaby was a teacher now, bringing its own students to the place where it had learned so much. Leo shrieked with joy. "Barby! Barby came for birthday!" Barnaby didn't come close. The wild had claimed it more fully now, but the bear sat in that familiar spot and watched as Leo blew out his candles. Then, in a moment that would be replayed on Dr. Chen's cameras thousands of times, Barnaby stood up and made a gesture with its paws, bringing them together and apart 3 times. It looked like clapping, but also like counting. 3. Leo was 3. Barnaby knew, remembered, and had come to acknowledge this milestone. The younger cubs watched their teacher, then clumsily attempted the same gesture, learning that this place, these people, were special and safe. As summer progressed, the forest classroom expanded beyond anything they could have imagined. Bears of different ages would appear at various times, each seeming to know the rules: maintain distance, be respectful, learn by observation. Some came to use the bathroom area and nothing more. Others would sit and watch Leo play for hours. A few brought gifts or attempted to replicate behaviors they observed. One particularly clever bear figured out how to stack rocks to create a shelter from rain after watching Ethan build a lean-to for firewood. The behavior spread through the population, and soon they were finding these little rock shelters throughout the forest. The impact went beyond just the bears. Other animals began to observe and learn. A family of raccoons started using a designated washing area after watching the bears clean their paws. Crows would line up on the fence to watch Leo's learning sessions, cawing in what seemed like approval when he got something right. Even the deer seemed less skittish, grazing closer to the cabin as if understanding that this was a place of peace and learning. The boundaries between wild and domestic were blurring in the most beautiful way possible, creating a harmony that felt ancient and new at the same time. Leo started preschool in September, riding the bus down the mountain twice a week. He would come home full of stories about what he had learned, and he would stand on the porch and repeat everything for whatever bears happened to be watching. "Today we learned about colors," he would announce. "Red like apples, blue like sky, brown like Barby." The bears would watch with their usual intensity, and sometimes they would bring items that matched the colors he described: a red leaf, a blue feather, a brown acorn. It was their way of participating, of showing they understood. One day, Leo's teacher asked the class to draw their best friend. While other children drew humans or pets, Leo drew a detailed picture of a bear. "This is Barnaby," he explained to his confused teacher. "He learned to use the potty with me. He teaches other bears now." The teacher smiled and nodded, filing it away as childhood imagination. But when she mentioned it to Lily at pickup, Lily simply said, "Leo has a very special relationship with nature." If only the teacher knew how literally true that was. The drawing went on the refrigerator at home, and they made sure to show it to the forest, knowing somehow that Barnaby would know. October brought the return of colder weather and with it a full reunion. Barnaby appeared one morning with what was clearly its own cub, a tiny thing, probably born that spring, clinging nervously to its parent's side. Barnaby, they could now tell it was female from her maternal behavior, sat in her old spot, grooming her cub while watching the cabin. Leo was beside himself with excitement. "Barby has baby! Barby is mommy!" The little cub was curious but shy, peeking out from behind its mother to stare at the strange, hairless creatures on the porch. Over the following days, they watched Barnaby teach her cub the same lessons she had learned years ago. The designated bathroom area, the proper distance to maintain, the exchange of gifts, the observation protocols, all of it was carefully demonstrated. But more than that, Barnaby was teaching her cub about trust, about the possibility of connection across species boundaries. The little cub would practice the greeting hop, would attempt to stack sticks, would sit patiently and watch Leo play. It was like watching their entire experience begin again, but this time with the wisdom of what had come before. Dr. Chen's research had attracted international attention, though she was careful to keep the location secret. She spoke at conferences about the implications of their observations, that animals might have culture, might pass down learned behaviors through teaching rather than just instinct, might be capable of abstract thought and emotional connections, far beyond what science had previously accepted. But she always emphasized that the most important aspect wasn't the science, but the respect and patience that had allowed these connections to form. "We didn't train these bears," she would say. "We simply created a space where learning could happen naturally, where trust could grow." November arrived with the first serious snow of the season, and with it came a surprise that would stay with them forever. Leo had been practicing writing his name in large letters on a piece of cardboard, sounding out each letter as he wrote. L-E-O, Leo. He left the cardboard on the porch when they went inside for lunch. When they came back out, there were muddy paw prints on the cardboard, but they weren't random. The prints seemed to follow the pattern of the letters, as if something had been tracing them. Next to the cardboard, drawn in the snow with a careful paw, were 3 rough marks that looked almost like an attempt at letters. They couldn't be sure, of course. It might have been coincidence, might have been their imagination seeing patterns where none existed, but Leo had no doubts. "Barby learning letters," he declared. From then on, he would practice his writing outside whenever possible, making his letters big and clear, and sometimes they would find marks in the dirt or snow nearby, marks that seemed too deliberate to be random. Whether it was true attempted writing or just imitation of the physical act, it represented something profound, the desire to communicate, to bridge the gap between worlds with symbols and meaning. The winter was harsh, but the connection remained strong. The bears had prepared well, thanks in part to what they had learned about planning and resource management from watching the humans. They had seen how Ethan stored firewood, how Lily preserved food, how they prepared for storms. The bears adapted these observations to their own needs, creating more elaborate dens, storing food in multiple caches, even working together in ways that bears typically didn't. The local bear population was thriving, showing lower stress levels and better health than populations in other areas. They had learned that cooperation and planning could make survival easier. One snowy December morning, they woke to find something extraordinary. Outside, arranged in the snow, were dozens of objects, pine cones, stones, sticks, leaves, arranged in a massive spiral pattern that must have taken hours to create. At the center of the spiral was Barnaby with her cub, and around the edges were at least a dozen other bears of various ages. It was like a gathering, a ceremony, a celebration of some kind. Leo watched from the window, mesmerized. "Bear party," he whispered. They watched as each bear added something to the pattern, then moved to a specific position, creating a living mandala in the snow. Dr. Chen was practically vibrating with excitement when she reviewed the footage. "This is unprecedented," she said. "Collaborative art, ceremonial gathering, symbolic representation. These are behaviors we associate with human culture, not wildlife." But as they watched the bears maintain their formation for nearly an hour, occasionally adjusting positions or adding elements to the pattern, it became clear that the division between human and animal consciousness wasn't as clear as they had thought. These bears were thinking, planning, creating together. They had culture, tradition, meaning beyond mere survival. The ceremony, if that's what it was, ended when Barnaby stood up and did the greeting hop 3 times. All the other bears responded with their own hops, then gradually dispersed back into the forest. But the pattern remained in the snow for days until the next storm covered it. Leo insisted on drawing it in his notebook, capturing the design as best as his young hands could manage. "For when I'm big," he explained, "so I remember the bear party." Lily helped him, creating a more accurate diagram that they would treasure forever. As the year drew to a close, they reflected on how much had changed since that first morning when a lone cub had appeared at their tree line. What had started as a simple potty training experience had evolved into something that challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness, intelligence, and the possibility of connection across species. Leo had not just learned to use the toilet, he had learned empathy, patience, and the joy of teaching. Barnaby had not just observed human behavior, she had adapted it, improved upon it, and passed it on to others. Together, they had created something new, a bridge between worlds that had seemed forever separate. New Year's Eve was quiet at the cabin, but not lonely. As midnight approached, they stood on the porch despite the cold, looking out at the forest. They could see eyes reflecting their porch light, not just 1 or 2 pairs, but dozens. The bears were there, watching, waiting. As the clock struck midnight and they cheered and hugged, a sound rose from the forest, not quite a roar, not quite a howl, but something in between, a chorus of voices acknowledging the moment. Leo laughed and called out, "Happy New Year, bears!" And from somewhere in that darkness they could swear they heard Barnaby's distinctive huff of acknowledgement. January brought new challenges and new learning. Leo was becoming more sophisticated in his play and learning, working on puzzles and basic math. The bears watched these new activities with interest, and some began showing remarkable problem-solving abilities. One young bear figured out how to move multiple objects to reach food placed high in a tree, creating a primitive ladder. Another learned to sort objects not just by size or color, but by multiple characteristics simultaneously. The learning was accelerating, building on itself, creating possibilities that none of them had imagined. Dr. Chen's team was documenting behaviors that would reshape entire fields of study. But perhaps the most touching development was the emergence of what could only be called friendships among the bears. Cubs that had met at the cabin would seek each other out in the forest, playing and learning together in ways that went beyond typical bear behavior. They had created a community, bound not by territory or blood, but by shared experience and knowledge. Barnaby seemed to be at the center of this community, a teacher and leader who had shown them a different way of being. Her own cub was growing rapidly, showing signs of the same remarkable intelligence and curiosity that had made Barnaby special. February was unseasonably warm, bringing early thaws and the promise of spring. The bears were more active, and the cabin had become a regular gathering place for what Dr. Chen had started calling forest school. Young bears would arrive in the morning, observe whatever activities were happening, practice various skills, and then disperse in the afternoon. Some days focused on practical skills like foraging or den building. Other days seemed more playful, with bears attempting to replicate Leo's games or creating their own. The adult bears supervised from a distance, intervening only when necessary, allowing the young to explore and learn. One particularly memorable day, Leo decided to put on a show. He had been learning simple songs in preschool and wanted to perform them. He stood on the porch with his toy microphone, singing "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" at the top of his lungs. The bears watched with what seemed like fascination. When he finished, there was a moment of silence. Then one of the younger bears stood up and made a series of rhythmic huffing sounds. Another joined in with a different pattern. Soon, several bears were creating what could only be described as music. Not melodic in the human sense, but definitely rhythmic, definitely intentional, definitely communal. This musical experimentation became a regular occurrence. Leo would sing or play his toy instruments, and the bears would respond with their own sounds. Over time, patterns emerged. Certain sound combinations seemed to have meaning. A specific rhythm for greeting, another for warning, yet another for play. They were developing a richer communication system, inspired by but not limited to human music. Dr. Chen brought in an ethnomusicologist who was astounded by what she heard. "They're creating a hybrid form of expression," she said. "Part bear vocalization, part learned rhythm, entirely unique." March marked 2 years since Barnaby's first appearance, and the changes were remarkable. The local bear population had developed behaviors seen nowhere else in the world. They maintained cleaner territories, showed more cooperation, and demonstrated problem-solving abilities that challenged every assumption about bear intelligence. But more than that, they had developed what could only be called culture, shared behaviors, traditions, and knowledge passed from one generation to the next. The cabin had become a cultural center, a place where knowledge was exchanged and preserved. Leo, now 4.5, had developed his own role in this unusual community. He was a teacher, a bridge, a translator between worlds. He would explain human concepts in simple terms, demonstrate new skills, and celebrate the bear's achievements with genuine joy. His parents marveled at his empathy and understanding, traits developed through his unique friendship with Barnaby. He never showed fear of the bears, but he also never forgot the boundaries that kept everyone safe. He understood, in a way that many adults didn't, that respect and love could coexist with appropriate distance. One spring morning, something happened that would be remembered as a turning point. A group of hikers had gotten severely lost and stumbled into the area, exhausted and frightened. They were shocked to find themselves surrounded by bears, but even more shocked when the bears didn't attack. Instead, the bears seemed to guide them, maintaining distance but clearly indicating direction. They herded the hikers toward the cabin, where Ethan and Lily were able to help them and call for rescue. The hikers left with a story no one would believe, bears that had saved them, that had shown them the way to safety. Dr. Chen interviewed the hikers extensively, documenting their experience. It was clear evidence that the bears had developed not just intelligence, but what might be called moral behavior, the choice to help rather than harm, to recognize humans in distress and respond with assistance. This went beyond learned behavior into the realm of ethical decision-making. The implications were staggering. If bears could develop morality through observation and teaching, what did that say about the nature of consciousness, about the potential for growth and change in all living beings? April brought new growth and new life. Several of the female bears had cubs, and they brought them to the cabin for what had become a tradition. Introduction to the learning place. Leo would wave at each new cub, welcoming them to what he called forest school. The cubs would watch him with wide eyes, beginning their own journey of discovery. Barnaby's cub from the previous year was now independent enough to visit alone, showing the same remarkable curiosity that had characterized its mother. The cycle was continuing, each generation building on the knowledge of the one before. The research had attracted worldwide attention, though the location remained protected. Documentaries were being made using Dr. Chen's footage, but careful not to reveal identifying landmarks. The story of Leo and Barnaby had become legend in certain circles, proof that the boundaries between human and animal consciousness were far more fluid than anyone had imagined. But for Leo and his parents, it remained personal, intimate, a daily miracle that had become beautifully ordinary. They no longer questioned the impossible. They simply lived it. May brought warm weather and longer days, perfect for extended learning sessions. Leo had started learning to read simple books, and he would sit on the porch reading aloud. The bears seemed to enjoy the sound of his voice, gathering in larger numbers for story time. Whether they understood the words or simply enjoyed the rhythm and tone didn't matter. What mattered was the shared experience, the community that had formed around learning and growth. Some of the bears had started bringing objects that seemed to relate to the stories. A feather when Leo read about birds, a particularly round stone when he read about the moon. One afternoon, Barnaby appeared with something unusual, a piece of paper, weathered and dirty but clearly human-made. She placed it carefully where Leo could reach it, then sat back expectantly. It was a page from a children's book, one that must have blown from someone's campsite miles away. But Barnaby had recognized it as something important, something connected to the reading sessions. Leo was thrilled. "Barby brought book," he exclaimed. He read the page to Barnaby, mostly making up words based on the pictures, and the bear listened with her usual intense attention. This incident sparked a new development. The bears began bringing more human artifacts they found in the forest. Not garbage, but things that seemed meaningful. A child's lost toy, a hiking boot, a camping cup. Each item was presented carefully, as if the bears were trying to understand the human world through these objects. Ethan and Lily started a collection, documenting where and when each item was brought. It was like an archaeological exhibit in reverse. Instead of humans studying artifacts to understand another culture, the bears were studying human objects to understand them. June brought the fullness of summer, and with it, a challenge. Developers had bought land nearby and were planning to build vacation homes. The construction would disrupt the delicate ecosystem that had developed, potentially driving the bears away or into conflict with new human residents. Ethan and Lily were devastated, but they didn't know how to stop it. The land was privately owned, the development was legal, and their story, while remarkable, had no legal standing. It seemed like their magical experiment was coming to an end, but they had underestimated both Dr. Chen and the power of their story. The researcher had been carefully building a case for the area to be designated as a critical research site, gathering support from universities and conservation organizations worldwide. When the development was announced, she mobilized this network. Within weeks, a coalition had formed to purchase the land and create a protected research area. The story of Leo and Barnaby, told carefully and compellingly, had captured the imagination of people around the world. Donations poured in. The land was purchased and protected, ensuring that the forest school could continue. The bears seemed to sense that something important had happened. The day the protection was finalized, More bears appeared at the cabin than ever before. Not just the regular students, but older bears, mothers with cubs, even a few massive males who normally kept to themselves. They arranged themselves in a semicircle facing the cabin, silent and still. It felt like a ceremony, an acknowledgement, a thank you. Leo stood on the porch and bowed to them, a gesture he had seen in a book about Japan. One by one, the bears lowered their heads in response. It was a moment of perfect understanding, a treaty signed without words. July was a time of celebration and consolidation. The protected status meant that research could expand, but also that it had to be more carefully managed. Dr. Chen established protocols to ensure that the bears' natural behaviors weren't disrupted by too much human presence. The cabin remained the center, but observation blinds were built at strategic points to allow for study without interference. Leo was designated as an official junior researcher, possibly the youngest in scientific history. He took his role seriously, maintaining his journal of bear observations with growing sophistication. The bears adapted to the new arrangements quickly, seeming to understand that the additional humans were connected to their friends at the cabin. They maintained their routines, their learning sessions, their gift exchanges. If anything, the behaviors became more complex and interesting. One group of young bears had started what could only be described as competitive games, racing to complete tasks, seeing who could stack objects highest, even what looked like a rudimentary form of hide-and-seek. They were playing, but it was play with purpose, each game teaching skills and reinforcing social bonds. August brought an unexpected visitor. A wildlife photographer who had heard rumors of the unusual bear behaviors had trekked into the area, ignoring the private property signs. He set up his equipment near the cabin, hoping to capture something sensational. But the bears knew he didn't belong. They didn't appear that day or the next, despite Leo's calls and usual activities. It was only when Ethan firmly but politely asked the photographer to leave, explaining that trust had to be earned here, that the bears began to return. They had been watching, waiting, protecting the sanctity of their learning space. This incident led to an important realization. The bears weren't just passively learning, they were active participants in maintaining the special nature of this place. They could distinguish between welcome and unwelcome visitors, between those who came with respect and those who came to exploit. They were, in their own way, guardians of the forest school. Barnaby in particular seemed to have taken on this role, often appearing first to assess new situations before signaling to the others that it was safe to emerge. September marked Leo's entry into kindergarten, a full-day program that meant less time at the cabin during the week. The bears adjusted their schedules accordingly, appearing more often on weekends and afternoons. Some had even started visiting the school bus stop, watching from a safe distance as Leo got on and off. The bus driver, initially terrified, had grown used to what she called her forest welcoming committee. She had even started carrying apples to toss out the window, a practice that probably violated several regulations but had created its own small ritual of connection. One afternoon, Leo came home from school upset. He had tried to tell his classmates about Barnaby and the forest school, but they had laughed and said he was making it up. He stood on the porch with tears in his eyes, calling for Barnaby, needing the reassurance of his friend's presence. And Barnaby came, not immediately but within the hour, as if she had somehow sensed his distress. She sat in her usual spot and just watched him, steady and patient, until his tears dried. Then she did something new. She walked to a muddy patch and carefully pressed her paw into it, creating a perfect print. She looked at Leo, then at the print, then back at Leo. It was a gift, evidence, proof, validation. Leo carefully preserved that paw print, having his parents help him make a plaster cast. He brought it to school for show and tell, along with some of Dr. Chen's published papers, simplified for children, and photos that had been approved for public release. His classmates were amazed, his teacher was intrigued, and Leo learned an important lesson about truth and belief, about how sometimes the most amazing things are the hardest to share. But he also learned that truth doesn't need everyone's belief to be real. It just needs to be lived. October brought brilliant colors to the forest and a new phase in the bears' education. They had started showing interest in human tools, not just observing their use but attempting to understand their purpose. One young bear had figured out that a stick could be used to extend reach, a discovery it demonstrated proudly by knocking apples from high branches. Another had learned that flat stones could be used to crack nuts more efficiently than teeth alone. These discoveries spread through the population rapidly, each bear teaching others, refining techniques, improving on the original innovations. Dr. Chen brought in a cognitive scientist who specialized in tool use in animals. After observing for several weeks, he was speechless. They're not just using tools, he finally managed. They're innovating, teaching, improving. They're showing cumulative cultural evolution, each generation building on the achievements of the last. This should be impossible. But there it was, happening before their eyes. The impossible had become routine at the forest school. Bears were writing their own chapter in the story of consciousness and intelligence. Halloween presented an interesting challenge. Leo wanted to trick or treat, but the nearest neighbors were miles away, so they created their own version. Ethan and Lily set up stations around the property, each with different treats for Leo and appropriate bear snacks for his forest friends. Leo dressed as a bear, complete with fuzzy ears and painted nose. When he emerged on the porch in his costume, the watching bears seemed confused at first, then almost amused. One of the younger bears stood up and did a little dance, as if acknowledging the attempt at transformation. The trick-or-treating became a parade of sorts, with Leo going from station to station and the bears following at a safe distance, collecting their own treats. At one point, Leo turned to see a line of bears behind him, all walking upright for a few steps at a time, as if they too were in costume, pretending to be human. The absurdity and beauty of it made everyone laugh. Here was play at its purest, cross-species, joyful, and completely unprecedented. The photographs from that day would become some of the most treasured in their collection. November was marked by an important development. Barnaby had begun bringing other adult females to observe Leo's learning sessions, and these females were bringing their own cubs. It was becoming clear that Barnaby was not just a teacher, but a leader, organizing and structuring the learning experiences for the broader community. She had developed a system. Younger cubs would watch from farther away, older cubs could come closer, and the most advanced students could participate more directly. It was a classroom structure, developed independently by bears who had never experienced formal education. One cold morning, they witnessed something that would stay with them forever. A very old bear, grizzled and slow, emerged from the forest. The other bears parted respectfully, allowing the elder to approach closer than any bear had come before. The old bear sat heavily just 20 feet from the porch, breathing labored, but eyes bright and aware. Leo, without prompting, walked to the edge of the porch and sat down, matching the old bear's posture. They sat together in silence for nearly an hour, old and young, human and bear, sharing something beyond words. When the old bear finally rose and walked slowly back to the forest, they knew they would not see it again. But its visit felt like a blessing, an acknowledgement from the wild itself that what was happening here was important and good. December brought snow and the approach of another year's end. The bears were preparing for winter, but their preparations were notably different from typical bear behavior. They were working together more, sharing information about food sources, even seeming to help weaker members of the community prepare adequate dens. The social structure that had developed around the forest school was creating a more cooperative, more successful bear community. Their survival rates were higher, their stress levels lower, their cubs healthier and more robust. The experiment in learning had become an experiment in living differently. Dr. Chen published her comprehensive study that month, and it sent shockwaves through multiple scientific disciplines. The evidence was undeniable. Bears were capable of cultural learning, abstract thinking, and behavioral modification far beyond what anyone had imagined. But more than that, the study showed that the capacity for growth and change existed in all conscious beings, that the boundaries between human and animal intelligence were constructs that could be crossed with patience, respect, and genuine connection. The forest school had become a symbol of possibility, a reminder that the world was far more mysterious and wonderful than most people imagined. Christmas Eve brought a special gathering. Word had somehow spread through the forest, and bears appeared throughout the day, more than they had ever seen at once. By evening, there were dozens arranged in a huge semicircle around the cabin. Leo had insisted on decorating a tree at the forest edge for them, hanging it with strings of berries and suet balls. As the sun set, the decorated tree seemed to glow in the fading light, and the bears sat in silent appreciation. Then, one by one, they began to make soft sounds. Not quite singing, but rhythmic, harmonious, creating a chorus that rose and fell like breathing. Leo stood on the porch with his parents, listening to this bear carol, tears streaming down all their faces. This was beyond science, beyond research, beyond explanation. This was connection at its deepest level, a recognition of shared existence, shared joy, shared wonder at the mystery of being alive. When the sound finally faded, Barnaby stood and walked forward, closer than she had come in months. She raised one paw toward them, held it there for a long moment, then turned and led the other bears back into the forest. It was a goodbye, but also a promise. We are here, we are connected, we continue. Christmas morning brought its own miracle. Arranged on the porch were gifts from the forest, not just the usual pine cones and pretty stones, but elaborate constructions. Wreaths woven from flexible branches, patterns made from berries and nuts, even what looked like attempt at sculpture using mud and sticks. Each gift was unique, personal, created with obvious care and intention. Leo spent the entire morning examining each one, trying to identify which bear might have made what. "This one's from Barby," he said confidently about a particularly intricate arrangement. "She remembers I like spirals." As the year ended, they reflected on the journey that had begun with a simple potty training experience, and had evolved into something that challenged the very foundations of how humans understood consciousness and intelligence. Leo had learned not just practical skills, but profound lessons about patience, respect, and the possibility of connection across any boundary. The bears had learned not just human behaviors, but new ways of being in the world, ways that made their lives richer and more successful. Together, they had created something unprecedented, a true meeting of minds across species boundaries. New Year's Day brought fresh snow and a fresh beginning. Leo was 5 now, reading and writing with increasing skill, his understanding of the world shaped profoundly by his unusual childhood. He had started writing his own book about Barnaby, illustrating it with careful drawings of his forest friends. "So other kids will know it's real," he explained. His parents helped him with the words, but the heart of the story was purely his. A tale of friendship that transcended every barrier, of learning that went both directions, of love that didn't require words. The forest school continued to evolve. New bears arrived regularly, drawn by something they couldn't name but recognized as important. The original students had become teachers themselves, passing on not just specific behaviors but an entire approach to learning and growth. The culture that had developed was self-sustaining now, no longer dependent on the daily interactions at the cabin but enriched by them. Dr. Chen had started calling it parallel evolution, two species developing together, each making the other more than they could be alone. One day, in late January, something extraordinary happened that brought their entire experience full circle. A young mother arrived at the local hospital, desperate and frightened. She had been camping with her toddler when a storm hit, and they had become separated from their group. Lost in the forest for 2 days, they had been guided to safety by bears. Bears that didn't attack, didn't threaten, but actively helped them find their way. The toddler kept talking about the nice bears that had showed them where to find water, where to shelter, how to get to the road. The story made local news, though most people remained skeptical. But Ethan and Lily knew it was true. The bears of their forest had learned something more valuable than any specific skill. They had learned empathy, compassion, the choice to help rather than harm. The forest school had created not just smarter bears but better bears, bears that understood their connection to all life and chose to honor it. When they saw the interview with the rescued mother, tears streaming down her face as she described the bear that had gently herded her child away from a cliff edge, they recognized Barnaby's influence. The lessons of the forest school had spread far beyond what they could see from their cabin. February brought a documentary crew, carefully vetted by Dr. Chen and approved by the family. They filmed for weeks, capturing the daily miracles that had become routine. Bears using tools, teaching each other, creating art, showing empathy. But what struck them most was Leo, this remarkable child who moved between worlds with such ease, who spoke to bears and humans with equal respect, who had learned lessons most people never get to learn. "He's going to change the world," the director said to Lily. A child who grows up knowing that consciousness and intelligence exist everywhere, who has experienced connection across species boundaries. Imagine what he'll be able to accomplish. But Leo wasn't thinking about changing the world. He was focused on the immediate, the personal. Barnaby's second cub was learning to stack rocks, and Leo was determined to help it succeed. He demonstrated repeatedly, patiently, the same way Barnaby had once watched him learn. The cub tried and failed, but Leo never gave up. "You can do it," he whispered encouragingly. "Barby's baby can do anything." And eventually the cub succeeded, creating a small tower that stood for several seconds before toppling. The joy on Leo's face was matched by what could only be described as pride on Barnaby's. March brought the 3rd anniversary of that first meeting, and with it, a celebration. Not planned by humans, but organized somehow by the bears themselves. They appeared throughout the day in groups, each performing some behavior they had learned. Tool use, pattern making, even what looked like counting. It was like a graduation ceremony, a demonstration of all they had achieved. The grand finale came when Barnaby's first cub, now fully grown, carefully drew something in the mud with a stick. It took them a moment to recognize it, a rough but unmistakable L, the first letter of Leo's name. The bears had not just learned behaviors, they had begun to grasp symbols, meaning the foundations of abstract communication. Dr. Chen was beyond excited. "This is it," she said, barely able to contain herself. This is the breakthrough. If they can understand that symbols represent things, that marks can carry meaning, then real communication. Not just behavioral mimicry, but actual exchange of abstract ideas might be possible. She began developing a simple symbol system, basic shapes that could represent common concepts. Leo was eager to help, spending hours practicing with shapes and their meanings, then demonstrating for his forest students. The bears watched with their usual intensity, and some began attempting to recreate the symbols. Spring arrived with warmth and new growth, and with it, a new understanding of what had been accomplished. The forest school was no longer an experiment. It was a reality, a functioning system of cross-species education and cultural exchange. Other researchers were attempting to replicate it in different locations with varying degrees of success. But everyone acknowledged that what had happened here was unique, sparked by the perfect combination of Leo's innocent openness, his parents' patient support, Barnaby's exceptional intelligence, and the mysterious synchronicity that had brought them all together. The bears had developed what anthropologists were calling a hybrid culture. Neither fully bear nor human, but something new, something unprecedented. They maintained their wild nature, their essential bareness, but enhanced with learned behaviors and cognitive strategies that made their lives more successful. They were still wild animals, but they were wild animals that had chosen to learn, to grow, to connect. The implications for conservation, for our understanding of consciousness, for the future of human-animal relationships, were staggering. One warm April morning, Leo made an announcement. "I want to teach Barby to read." His parents exchanged glances, unsure how to respond. Reading seemed like a bridge too far, a human skill that required cognitive capabilities they weren't sure bears possessed. But Leo was insistent. He had noticed that some bears could recognize symbols, could even reproduce simple ones. Why not letters? Why not words? "Barby is smart," he said simply. "She can learn anything." And so began perhaps the most ambitious phase of the forest school experiment. Leo started simple, with single letters associated with concrete objects. A with an apple, B with a ball, which he associated with Barnaby, C with a cup. He would show the letter, show the object, repeat the sound. The bears watched, some with more interest than others. Barnaby, as always, was the most attentive student. After weeks of repetition, something clicked. When Leo showed the letter A without the apple, Barnaby would look around as if searching for the fruit. She had made the connection between symbol and object. It wasn't reading in the full sense, but it was the beginning of symbolic understanding. May brought unexpected validation. A team of international observers arrived, skeptics who had questioned Dr. Chen's findings. They expected to find exaggeration, wishful thinking, anthropomorphization. Instead, they found themselves speechless as they watched bears demonstrating behaviors that challenged every assumption they had held. One elderly professor, who had spent his entire career studying animal cognition, sat on the porch with tears streaming down his face. "I've been wrong," he said quietly. "We've all been wrong. They're not lesser beings. They're different beings, with their own form of consciousness, their own potential for growth." The visit ended with the skeptics becoming advocates, spreading the word about the forest school to academic institutions worldwide. Funding increased, allowing for better facilities and more comprehensive research. But Ethan and Lily were careful to maintain the heart of what made this place special. It remained a home first, a research site second. Leo's relationship with the bears, especially Barnaby, remained the centerpiece. Without that genuine connection, that bridge of innocent love and trust. None of the rest would be possible. June brought summer fullness, and with it, a realization that Leo was growing up. He would start first grade in the fall, would be gone most of the day, would gradually move into a world where his bear friends couldn't follow. He seemed to sense this transition and became determined to teach the bears as much as possible while he could. Every day was filled with demonstrations, explanations, patient repetition of concepts and skills. The bears seemed to sense the urgency, too, appearing in larger numbers, staying longer, paying even closer attention than usual. One evening, as the sun set through the trees, Barnaby did something that took everyone's breath away. She gathered several objects, a stick, a stone, a leaf, and arranged them deliberately. Then, using her paw in the dirt, she drew a circle around them. She looked at Leo, then added another object to the group. She had understood not just counting, but the concept of addition. She was doing math, simple math, but math nonetheless. Leo jumped up and down with excitement. Barby can count. Barby can add. The implications were staggering. If bears could understand mathematical concepts, what else might be possible? July was a month of consolidation and documentation. Dr. Chen's team worked to capture and catalog all the behaviors that had developed, creating a comprehensive record of the forest school's achievements. The list was extraordinary. Tool use and modification, symbolic recognition, basic counting and addition, pattern creation and replication, empathetic behavior, cooperative problem solving, cultural transmission of knowledge, and even what appeared to be aesthetic choices in the arrangements and constructions the bears created. Each behavior alone would have been significant. Together, they represented a revolution in understanding animal consciousness. But beyond the scientific achievements, what struck everyone was the joy evident in these interactions. The bears weren't performing tricks for rewards. They were genuinely engaged in learning for its own sake. They showed pride in their accomplishments, frustration with failures, excitement about new challenges. They had developed what could only be called a love of learning, a curiosity about the world that went beyond survival needs. This was perhaps the most human trait of all, and yet here it was, flourishing in the forest among bears. August brought a bittersweet milestone. Barnaby's first cub, now a fully grown bear, arrived with cubs of its own, twins, tiny and curious, peeking out from behind their parents' legs. 3 generations of forest school students were now present, each carrying forward the lessons learned. Leo was ecstatic. Barby is a grandma, he announced proudly. Barnaby seemed to understand the significance, too, grooming the new cubs with obvious care, already beginning to teach them the basics of forest school protocol. The generational transfer of knowledge was perhaps the most significant proof of what had been accomplished. This wasn't just individual bears learning behaviors, this was culture being created and transmitted, evolving and improving with each generation. The twin cubs would grow up in a world where the boundary between bear and human was permeable, where learning from another species was normal, where their potential was limited only by their curiosity and effort. They would never know a world without the forest school, and that would shape them in ways no one could fully predict. September arrived too quickly, bringing Leo's first day of first grade. He stood at the bus stop in his new backpack and shoes, looking very grown up but also very small. The bears had gathered at the forest edge, more than had ever appeared at once for a non-ceremony. They seemed to understand this was a transition, a marking point. As the bus pulled up, Leo turned and waved at them. "I'll be back," he called. "I'll learn new things to teach you." And then he was gone, carried away to a world the bears couldn't enter. The afternoon couldn't come fast enough. When the bus finally returned, Leo burst out and ran toward the cabin, his backpack bouncing. The bears were waiting, Barnaby in her usual spot, others arranged in their learning positions. Leo pulled out his folder, showing them his first-grade work. Letters traced carefully, numbers in neat rows, a drawing of his family that now included several bears. He explained everything in detail, as if the bears were his students and he was their teacher. And in a way, he was. The forest school had reversed, with Leo bringing human knowledge to eager animal students. October painted the forest in brilliant colors and brought a proposal that would change everything. A major university wanted to establish a permanent research station at the site, with Leo's family as permanent residents and caretakers. It would mean financial security, resources for expansion, and the guarantee that the forest school could continue indefinitely. But it also meant more people, more structure, more formality. Ethan and Lily struggled with the decision, worried about losing the magic in the pursuit of science. It was Leo who provided clarity. "The bears trust us," he said simply. "If we say it's okay, they'll know it's okay." And he was right. The bears had learned to read human intentions, to distinguish between those who came with respect and those who didn't. If the family remained at the center as the bridge between worlds, the expansion could work. They accepted the proposal with conditions. The family's home would remain private, Leo's relationship with the bears would be protected, and any research would prioritize the animals' well-being over scientific advancement. November brought construction crews, carefully supervised and restricted to specific areas. The bears watched from a distance, curious but cautious. Leo explained everything to them, using his growing vocabulary and the simple symbol system they had developed. "Friends coming," he would say, showing them symbols for human and friend and learn. Whether they fully understood or simply trusted him, the bears accepted the changes. Some even seemed interested in the construction itself, watching how humans built structures, how tools were used on a larger scale. The research station was designed to be minimally invasive. Observation blinds that looked like natural formations, cameras disguised as forest elements, gathering places that felt organic rather than artificial. The architect, after spending time at the site, had been inspired to create something that honored both the scientific importance and the spiritual significance of what was happening here. The result was a facility that seemed to grow from the forest itself, a physical manifestation of the bridge between worlds that the forest school represented. December brought the first snow and the first official researchers beyond Dr. Chen's team. They were carefully chosen, patient, respectful, genuinely interested in understanding rather than exploiting. Leo served as their introduction to the bears, standing on the porch and vouching for each new person. "This is Dr. Williams," he would say clearly. "She studies how animals think. She's nice." The bears would observe the new person carefully, and if Leo seemed comfortable, they would gradually accept the presence. The research expanded in directions no one had anticipated. Linguists studied the communication patterns that had developed. Anthropologists examined the cultural structures. Psychologists investigated the emotional bonds. Educators looked at the learning methods. Each discipline found something revolutionary in the forest school, something that challenged fundamental assumptions about their field. The site became a nexus of interdisciplinary study, all centered around a boy and a bear who had decided to learn together. Christmas brought another gathering, larger than the previous year. 3 generations of bears now participated in what had become an annual tradition. They brought gifts, not just natural objects now, but things they had made, constructed, modified. One bear had woven grass into what looked like a basket. Another had carved patterns into soft wood using its claws and teeth. Barnaby's contribution was the most remarkable, a collection of stones arranged to form a rough but recognizable representation of the cabin, complete with a tiny figure that could only be meant to represent Leo. The exchange of gifts had evolved into something profound, a recognition of shared celebration, of marking time together, of acknowledging the connections that had grown between them. Leo had made simple necklaces from string and wooden beads, each one slightly different. He presented them to the bears that were comfortable coming close enough, and several actually allowed him to drape the necklaces over their heads. The sight of bears wearing human-made jewelry should have been absurd, but instead it was beautiful, a visual representation of the cultural exchange that had occurred. New Year's Eve brought reflection on 3.5 years of the forest school. What had started as a curious bear watching a toddler learn to use the potty had evolved into something that was reshaping humanity's understanding of consciousness, intelligence, and the potential for connection across species boundaries. Leo, now 6.5, had grown up bilingual in a sense, fluent in human and conversant in bear. His worldview had been shaped by the knowledge that intelligence and emotion existed everywhere, that learning and growth were universal drives, that love could transcend any boundary. As midnight approached, they stood on the porch as had become tradition. The bears were there in the darkness, their eyes reflecting the porch lights like stars. When the clock struck 12, Leo called out, "Happy New Year, everybody." And from the forest came the response, huffs and growls and sounds that had taken on meaning through years of repetition. It wasn't human language, but it was language nonetheless, communication across the species divide, a conversation that would have been impossible to imagine just a few years before. January brought new challenges and new opportunities. The research station was fully operational, and data was being collected that would fuel scientific papers for decades. But more importantly, the forest school had become a model, inspiring similar projects worldwide. Not all would succeed. The unique combination of factors that had created this miracle were hard to replicate, but each attempt expanded humanity's understanding of what was possible. The bears of the forest had become unwitting ambassadors for their species, proving that wildlife deserved not just protection but respect as conscious, learning, growing beings. The most remarkable development was the emergence of what Dr. Yi Chen called bear technology, tools and techniques developed by the bears themselves, not just copied from humans. One innovative bear had created a water collection system using curved bark to channel rain into natural depressions. Another had developed a method for preserving fruit by burying it in specific types of soil. These innovations spread through the population and were improved upon by others. The bears were not just learning, they were inventing, creating, problem-solving in ways that were uniquely their own. February marked Leo's 7th birthday, celebrated with both human and bear friends. He had requested a forest party, held outside despite the cold, so everyone could participate. His school friends attended, initially nervous but quickly enchanted, as they watched Leo interact with the bears. One brave child even attempted to show the bears a magic trick, and while the bears probably didn't understand the concept of illusion, they seemed to enjoy the performance. It was a birthday party unlike any other, a celebration of the impossible made real. That evening, after the human guests had left, Barnaby approached closer than she had in months. She was getting older, moving more slowly, her muzzle showing gray. But her eyes remained bright, intelligent, full of the wisdom accumulated through years of learning and teaching. She sat just 10 feet from the porch and looked at Leo with such intensity that everyone fell silent. Then she did something she had never done before. She made a sound that was almost, not quite, but almost, like Leo. It wasn't perfect, it was barely recognizable, but it was an attempt at human speech, at saying his name. Leo's eyes filled with tears. "Barby," he whispered back. And the old bear huffed softly, a sound they had all come to recognize as acknowledgement, as yes, I understand, we are connected. She turned and walked back to the forest, moving slowly but with dignity, having given Leo the greatest gift she could, the attempt to speak his language as he had tried to understand hers. It was a moment that transcended science, that touched something deeper than research could measure. March brought signs that Barnaby was preparing for something. She spent more time with her cubs and grandcubs, teaching them with increased intensity. She brought them to the cabin more frequently, making sure they knew the routines, the protocols, the relationships that had been built. She was passing on her role, ensuring continuity, preparing for a transition. Leo sensed it too, becoming quieter, more attentive, treasuring each interaction as if he knew they were numbered. One morning, Barnaby arrived with the entire extended family. Her cubs, grandcubs, and even some bears that seemed to be adopted students rather than blood relatives. She arranged them carefully, the young ones in front, older ones behind, creating a formal arrangement that had never been seen before. Then she walked forward, closer to the porch than she'd ever come in daylight, and stood directly in front of Leo. For a long moment, boy and bear looked at each other, 7 years of shared growth passing between them. Then Barnaby did something extraordinary. She reached out with one paw and gently, so gently, touched the porch step where Leo was standing. It was the first deliberate physical contact, the crossing of the final boundary. Leo slowly reached down and placed his small hand on the massive paw. They stayed like that for perhaps 5 seconds, bear and human, teacher and student, friends across an impossible divide. Then Barnaby withdrew her paw, turned to look at her assembled family as if to say, "You saw, you remember," and walked back to them. That was the last time they saw Barnaby at the cabin. She disappeared into the deeper forest, as old bears do when their time comes, but her legacy lived on in every bear that visited, in every behavior they had learned, in every boundary they had crossed. The forest school continued without its founding teacher, but her influence was everywhere. The cubs and grandcubs maintained the traditions, even developing new ones. The bathroom area was kept clean, gifts were exchanged, learning sessions continued. Barnaby had built something that would outlast her. Leo grieved quietly but deeply. He understood, in the way children can, that Barnaby had given him something precious and irreplaceable. The knowledge that connection was possible across any divide, that learning and growth were universal languages, that love didn't require words or even the same species. He threw himself into the work of the forest school with renewed dedication, honoring Barnaby's memory by teaching her descendants everything he could. April brought new life and new hope. Several of Barnaby's female descendants had cubs, and they brought them to the cabin as had become tradition. But one mother did something new. She pushed her cub forward and made a gesture that seemed to indicate Leo specifically. She wanted Leo to name her cub, to give it the human sound that would identify it in both worlds. Leo thought carefully, then said clearly, "Hope. This one is Hope." The mother bear huffed approval, and from then on, that cub responded to its name, coming closer when Leo called Hope, learning to associate the sound with itself. This naming ceremony became a new tradition. Each new cub would be presented to Leo for naming, cementing the bond between human and bear from the earliest age. The named bears seemed to learn faster, engage more deeply, as if having a human name gave them a special status in the forest school hierarchy. It was another evolution of the culture that had developed, another step in the creation of something entirely new, a shared community that transcended species boundaries. May brought international attention of a different kind. The United Nations was developing new protocols for wildlife protection based on the research from the Forest School. The evidence was undeniable. Animals were capable of far more than humans had imagined, deserving of rights and protections that recognize their consciousness and capacity for growth. Leo was invited to speak at a special session, the youngest person ever to address the UN. He stood at the podium, small but confident, and spoke simply. "The bears are my teachers and my friends. They learned from us, but we learned more from them. They showed us that everyone can learn, everyone can grow, everyone deserves respect." The speech went viral. Not because of its eloquence, but because of its simple truth delivered by a child who had lived it. Leo became an unwitting spokesperson for a new understanding of the natural world, but he remained focused on the daily work of the Forest School. Fame meant nothing to him compared to the joy of seeing Hope successfully stack her first blocks, or watching Barnaby's eldest grandcub figure out how to use a stick to write in the dirt. June brought summer, and with it, a surprise that delighted everyone. A very young bear, probably orphaned, appeared at the edge of the forest. But instead of being fearful or aggressive, it walked directly to the designated bathroom area, used it properly, then sat in exactly the spot where Barnaby used to sit. It had never been to the cabin before, but it knew the protocols. The Forest School had become legend among the bears. Knowledge passed from group to group. A cultural phenomenon that had spread beyond just the local population. This new cub, which Leo named Scholar, became the most dedicated student they had ever seen besides Barnaby herself. Scholar seemed to understand that this was a place of learning and threw itself into every lesson with enthusiasm. Within weeks, it was attempting to copy letters, stack objects, even use simple tools. It was as if Barnaby's spirit had returned in a new form, eager and brilliant and ready to bridge worlds. The older bears accepted Scholar immediately, teaching it their accumulated knowledge, preparing it for a role they seemed to recognize it was destined to fill. July brought a documentary film crew that would create the definitive record of the Forest School. They filmed for weeks, capturing not just the remarkable behaviors but the deep emotional connections that made it all possible. They interviewed Leo, now 7.5, who spoke about the bears with the wisdom of someone much older. "They're not like us," he said carefully, "but they're not less than us either. They're themselves, and that's perfect. We're just lucky they let us be friends." The documentary would go on to win numerous awards and inspire conservation efforts worldwide. But more importantly, it captured something that scientific papers couldn't: the joy, the wonder, the pure magic of what happened when species met as equals and chose to learn together. It showed Leo reading to a group of attentive bears. Bears teaching each other complex tool use. The evening gatherings where human and bear voices rose together in their strange hybrid communication. It made the impossible undeniable. August brought news that would secure the Forest School's future permanently. The area had been designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognizing it as a place of unique cultural and scientific importance. The protection was absolute. The forest and its inhabitants would be preserved in perpetuity. The research would continue, and the bridge between worlds that had been built here would be maintained for future generations. Leo was presented with a special award as the youngest UNESCO ambassador, but he was more excited about showing the bears the shiny medal than receiving it. The designation brought new resources and new responsibilities. Educational programs were developed to share the lessons of the Forest School with children worldwide. Virtual reality experiences allowed people to observe the bears without disturbing them. Scientific conferences were held to discuss the implications of what had been learned. But at the center of it all remained the simple daily reality: Leo and his family, the bears of the forest, and the patient work of learning and growing together. September brought another school year and new challenges for Leo. Second grade meant more complex subjects, and he was determined to share everything with his forest students. He began teaching basic science concepts, demonstrating gravity with falling objects, showing how water became ice, explaining the seasons using props and patience. The bears watched with their usual intensity, and some began conducting their own experiments, dropping objects from different heights, placing water in shaded areas to observe freezing, even tracking sun patterns throughout the day. One particularly bright bear, a descendant of Barnaby named Newton, after it dropped an apple on its own head and seemed surprised, showed remarkable aptitude for understanding cause and effect. Newton would create simple experiments, blocking a stream to see water build up, stacking rocks to see when they would fall, even testing which materials made the best den insulation. This scientific thinking spread to other bears, creating a population that approached the world with curiosity and systematic investigation rather than just instinct. October brought a milestone that no one had anticipated. Hope, the cub Leo had named in the spring, made a breakthrough that stunned even Dr. Chen. Using a stick and soft dirt, Hope deliberately drew 3 symbols in sequence, the established symbols for Leo, friend, and what looked like an attempt at a heart shape. It was a sentence, a declaration, a use of symbolic language to express an abstract concept. Hope had written, in its own way, "Leo is a friend I love." The implications were staggering. If bears could combine symbols to create meaning, true written communication might be possible. This breakthrough sparked intense development of the symbol system. Leo worked with researchers to create a simple visual language that could be drawn with sticks or paws, basic shapes representing common concepts that could be combined to express more complex ideas. The bears took to it with varying degrees of success, but several showed real aptitude. Within months, simple conversations were happening. A bear would draw symbols asking for a specific food. Leo would respond with symbols indicating when it would be available. It wasn't complex, but it was real communication through writing. November brought the first snow, and with it, a pattern drawn in the white expanse that took everyone's breath away. Multiple bears had worked together to create an enormous spiral in the snow, decorated with pine cones and stones arranged in deliberate patterns. At the center was a clear representation of the cabin, and radiating out from it were paths leading to different areas: the bathroom spot, the learning circle, the gift exchange place. It was a map, an artistic map, but a map nonetheless. The bears had created a visual representation of their world, centered on the place that had changed everything for them. Dr. Chen could barely contain her excitement. "They're creating art with meaning," she said. "Collaborative, symbolic, purposeful art. This is civilization. They're developing civilization." And in a way she was right. The bears had moved beyond mere survival into the realm of culture, meaning, and shared purpose. They were still wild, still bears, but they were also something new, something that had never existed before, a parallel society, developing alongside humanity, learning and growing and creating meaning in their own unique way. December brought another Christmas celebration, the 4th since Barnaby's departure, but somehow the most special. The bears had prepared something extraordinary, a performance. They arranged themselves in groups and took turns demonstrating different skills, but in a coordinated way that could only have been rehearsed. One group showed tool use, another demonstrated counting, a third created patterns with objects. It was like a talent show, a celebration of learning, a gift of achievement offered to their human friends. Leo watched with tears of joy, understanding that this was their way of saying thank you, of showing what his friendship and teaching had made possible. That night, after the bears had returned to the forest, Leo sat with his parents and talked about the future. He was 8 now, old enough to understand that what had happened here was unique and important. "I want to be a teacher," he said firmly. "Not just a regular teacher, but someone who teaches that everyone can learn. Every animal, every person, everyone. Barbai taught me that." His parents hugged him, knowing that whatever path he chose, he would carry the lessons of the forest school with him, spreading the message that consciousness and connection could be found everywhere if people just took the time to look. The year ended with a sense of completion and continuation. The forest school had evolved from a curious anomaly into an established institution, a place where the impossible happened daily. The bears continued to learn and grow, each generation building on the achievements of the last. Leo continued to bridge the worlds, growing into his role as translator, teacher, and friend. The research continued to challenge and reshape human understanding of consciousness and intelligence. And somewhere in the deeper forest, Barnaby's legacy lived on in every bear that chose curiosity over fear, connection over isolation, growth over stagnation. As they stood on the porch that New Year's Eve, looking out at the familiar gathering of glowing eyes in the darkness, they knew that this was just the beginning. The forest school had proved that the boundaries between species were constructs that could be crossed, that learning and growth were universal drives, that love and connection required no common language. What had started with a bear cub watching a toddler learn to use the potty had become a revolution in understanding what it meant to be conscious, to be alive, to be connected in the vast web of existence. The bears huffed their New Year's greeting, a sound that had become as familiar and meaningful as any human words. Leo called back his response, his voice carrying across the snow to his friends in the forest. And in that exchange, in that moment of perfect understanding between species that should have been forever separate, lay the hope for a future where all conscious beings could be recognized, respected, and allowed to reach their full potential. The forest school had opened a door that could never be closed again, and through it, both species could glimpse a world of infinite possibility.